I'm delighted that we have to speak about Adam Smith, Professor Ryan Hanley from Boston University. Ryan is one of the world's leading experts on Adam Smith, so we're lucky to have him with us. He completed his graduate work on the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago, and has written 4 books, specialist not just on Smith, but also on the Scottish Enlightenment, his milieu at the time. And your new work is on?
Fenelon.
Fenelon, okay, right, whose name was new to me, so I look forward to that. He's written 4 books, edited 5 books, numerous articles. I just wanted to say that this is my favorite of all edited books, which is, yes, Adam Smith, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And it's edited by Ryan, and like most economists, I came to Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments late. Perhaps I took Jacob Weiner's advice a little bit too literally, saying that Wealth of Nations is the most important book. Don't worry about the Theory of Moral Sentiments. And it was this volume that I actually picked up, and it's filled with my little notes. So it's a special pleasure to have you here, given that you're the one who actually your volume introduced me to this part of Smith's oeuvre. Okay, well today I don't think you're going to talk about that, but we'll find out what you're going to talk about. Your title is Adam Smith's Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Death of Nations, which has to be one of the best titles I've heard in a long time. So welcome. We look forward to your talk.
Great. Thank you, Bruce, for that incredibly kind introduction and also the very generous invitation. It's really a pleasure to be with you all here to talk a little bit of Smith. I apologize at the outset. I'll say almost nothing at all about this book that Bruce has just praised, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. I am going to talk a little bit about Smith's other work. And so with that in mind, let me begin by simply noting that the year 1776, this remarkable year in political and intellectual history, very famously saw the publication of one of the landmark texts of the Enlightenment. This is a work that inaugurated an intellectual revolution in the social sciences. I think one can say without the slightest bit of hyperbole that was every bit as significant as the political revolution then happening in the Atlantic world. And it accomplished this through its author's remarkable capacities on a number of fronts. First and foremost, a massive erudition gained from the study of the long history of European law and government. Secondly, a deep familiarity with the latest Enlightenment theories of political economy, and in particular, the stadial theories and histories of economic development. Third, a remarkable sensitivity to the ways in which the history of the ancient world and the medieval world continued to shape the modern world. And for all of these reasons, the text became and remains a founding text within its particular field of social science. Now, the 1776 text to which I refer, of course, I'm sure I don't need to tell people here in the Department of Economics at Duke, is... I was leading him to water. Thank you for being brave enough to take the bait on my punchline. No, it was Edward Gibbon's History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. That was a setup there for Bruce. Thank you. I think it would be impossible to overstate the significance of Gibbon's work in both his day and ours. But I think it's also impossible to overstate its significance for what I will just today call the other work of 1776, with apologies to Adam Smith, the Wealth of Nations. I wanted to begin this talk about Smith with Gibbon in mind for a very specific reason, because there's a specific significance of Gibbon for Smith, and in fact a twofold significance. The first is that is simply historical. Smith had a profound influence on The Decline and Fall. Gibbon and Smith were friends, and in the later volumes of The Decline and Fall that came out post-1776 through 1783, Smith's mark and influence is very explicit in Gibbon's wonderful footnotes. It's not these historical debts that I want to explore here. If anybody's interested in that, John Pocock, the great historian, has just written 6 massive tomes that address this question, among others. Instead, I want to look at a different significance, and that's not how Gibbon aligns with Smith, but rather how Smith aligns with Gibbon. And so I want to sort of reverse the causal arrow and attempt to read The Wealth of Nations in light of Gibbon's Decline and Fall. And specifically, I want to revisit The Wealth of Nations in light of the central theme of Gibbon's Decline and Fall, namely the decline and fall of the nation. And when we revisit Smith through this lens, what I want to show, what I hope to show, is that we see an overlooked, a genuinely overlooked, but core side of Smith's larger project as a political and economic theorist. The Wealth of Nations, of course, has been long and rightly celebrated for its insights into the processes of economic growth over time. But this extraordinarily well-known side of Smith's projects, I think, overshadowed Smith's deep interest in the question of political and economic decline. And more particularly, what I think's been overshadowed is Smith's deep appreciation of a paradox that lies squarely at the heart of his political thought. And that concerns, this paradox, the relationship between national opulence and national power. And put as simply and bluntly as I can at the outset, Smith very clearly believes that the end of political economy is to promote national opulence, but he also believes that the growth of national opulence necessarily leads to a decline in national power. And so in some deep sense that I want to try and begin to work out through this project, Smith sees in economic growth, the very end of his project, the seeds of national decline. And so for evidence that Smith in fact believed this, we have for testimony a number of his very explicit comments, especially in a text that is not as often attended to today by either Smith scholars or the larger world of historians of economic thought. And this is the lectures that he gave on the subject of jurisprudence during his time as a university professor at Glasgow. We now know that in these lectures were essentially the rough drafts of both the work that came to be published in 76 as The Wealth of Nations, but also the rough drafts of two other very long manuscripts, one on the history of law and government that Smith, as a Smith scholar I will say, very tragically consigned to the flames upon his death, believing that this book was imperfect. But in the lectures on jurisprudence, we have the best memorial testimonial to Smith's understanding of the ways in which economic and political processes in the history of Europe intertwined. And in this remarkable text, Smith says a number of remarkable things that I want to look at here. But just for starters, I'd like to start with Smith's remarkable claims with regard to the simple relationship of economic progress to national force. He lays out this paradox in a variety of places, and he puts it very bluntly to his students. These are, again, transcripts of his lectures to his student audience. As Bruce mentioned, I edited Smith's work. I came to very much love Smith's rhetoric, so I hope that you'll indulge me if I read a few of these lines that are up here on the slides. But in these two very short quotations, here he tells us the quote, "Thus it must happen that the improvement of arts and commerce must make a great declension in the force and power of the Republic in all cases." And so too, in a parallel passage a few pages further, quote, "Whenever, therefore, arts and commerce engage the citizens, either as artisans or master tradesmen, the strength and force of the city must be very much diminished." Now, these are just two of Smith's many statements, both published and unpublished, with regard to the relationship of economic progress to national power. And many others can be adduced, and we'll look at some later in the talk. But I wanted to begin here for a very specific reason, because these capture well not just this inverse or paradoxical relationship of national opulence to national power, but also what Smith invites us to see as this necessarily paradoxical relationship. As I just tried to emphasize in my own recitation of the quotes, there's this striking and oft-repeated word here, must. Smith presents this and invites us to see it as something like almost a law of necessity. And he's so deeply invested in this point and comes back to it in so many places that he compels us to ask, as interpreters and readers of Smith, at least two questions. The first is simply conceptual. That is, why did Smith believe that commercial wealth, quote unquote, must bring a decline in national power. What that is, did Smith believe to be the engine of this particular process, the mechanisms? But if the first question is conceptual, there's also necessarily a more practical and political question associated with it. Namely, given this seeming inevitability, or what he invites us to see as inevitability, what can and should wealthy nations do to stave off decline and fall? And Smith took this to be a remarkably urgent question because of how he understood national decline. And one of the things I hope that we'll see is that Smith saw this decline not in any ordinary sense of degeneration, but of decline to the point of, as I tried to allude in my title, decline to the point of death of the nation. And he frames it in terms of existential annihilation, as we're going to see in a few cases. And so the question of what is to be done is a practical question, but one I think that lies at the heart of Smith's thought as a political economist. Now, that said, given the constraints of time, I want to focus really in these remarks on the first of these questions, and I hope that in questions and answers, I'll make sure to leave some time that maybe we can take up the second, the what is to be done question. But I want to use the time that I have to take a deepest dive as possible into Smith's theory of the mechanisms of national decline, because I think Smith, in fact, gives two discrete and separable explanations for this seemingly paradoxical process. The first of these involves how national opulence renders a nation susceptible to external threats, whereas the second of these is focused squarely on how national opulence renders a nation susceptible to internal threats. And I want to use my time to take these up in order, beginning with the first of these, the external threats. Now, to motivate now this turn to the external threats, I want to start with one of Smith's most direct lessons. And this is his very direct advice in the fourth book of The Wealth of Nations, where he tells us very explicitly that, quote unquote, defense is much more important than opulence. This quote comes from Wealth of Nations 4.2.32. It comes in the context of a discussion of the 1651 Acts of Navigation, and I won't try to reframe Smith's positions on those very important trade regulations. What I want to focus on is the key place that this idea of the relationship of defense to opulence has in Smith's understanding of government, and especially in his understanding of the very purpose and origins of government. So with that, Smith tells us right at the beginning of the fifth part of The Wealth of Nations, when he turns to the duties of the sovereign, he tells us very explicitly, quote, the first duty of the sovereign is that of protecting the society from the violence and invasion of other independent societies, end quote. And so he tells us that guarding against external violence is the primary aim of government in his day. But not only did Smith see this as the primary aim of government in his day, his understandings of the origins of society continually come back to the need for external defense. And he tells us, and I'm going back all the way to the beginning of his stadial theory here, that collective social organization has its origins specifically in the need to provide against, as he here says, and I won't read the whole quotes here, a quote-unquote common enemy, providing assistance and protection against the common enemy. And it's for this reason, for quote-unquote mutual defense, that in the nations of hunters and fishers, there was village life was lived communally. The point, of course, here is that Smith sees here and elsewhere social life as having its origins in mutual defense and protection against invasion. And so on some very basic level, Smith sees military defense against foreign violence as the alpha and the omega of political society. Now, all that's clear enough, I think, very obvious. The challenge lies in how economic growth complicates defense. And here is where Smith introduces the paradox. One might have expected, especially given the context he was writing in 1776, for him to have argued that national opulence makes defense significantly easier. There's all kinds of obvious ways in which he could have argued this. For example, an increased tax base, it makes it possible easier to raise revenue to support a military. So too, national opulence, as Smith well knew, facilitates all sorts of new instruments for wartime borrowing for governments. But Smith doesn't emphasize these benefits of opulence vis-a-vis foreign threats, but rather a set of negative externalities. And these negative externalities consequent to the progress of opulence with regard to defense take several forms. The first is the corruption of character, and especially the ways in which opulence corrupts the martial virtues. And so here, in a series of paragraphs that are beginning to receive more attention than they received in many, I think it's fair to say, generations of Smith scholarship, Smith traces out what he calls the quote-unquote bad effects of commerce. These were the sorts of parts of the Wealth of Nations and the lectures on jurisprudence that were conveniently overlooked for many years. But Smith is very explicit in telling us that, quote, another bad effect of commerce is that it sinks the courage of mankind and tends to extinguish martial spirit. And he ends by telling us that because of divided specialized labor that leads workers to do repetitive things day in and day out, he tells us at the end, quote, by having their minds constantly employed on the arts of luxury, they, the workers, grow effeminate and dastardly. Now, this is one of several places, in fact, where Smith calls attention to how wealth corrupts virtue. And I think it's worth quoting in part for its, as I've tried to present, it's really quite hyperbolic rhetoric, this language of effeminacy and dastardliness. And it should be said that in The Wealth of Nations, he moderates, when he rewrites this particular paragraph, he moderates his rhetoric to some degree. But what's common in both the lectures on jurisprudence and The Wealth of Nations is Smith's insistence that this corruption of the martial virtues isn't just a moral problem, but a very practical political problem. Nations that lack military courage, Smith tells us again and again, are going to be unable to muster military force to be able to defend themselves against their enemies. I think the quote is also interesting for the point it makes about the specific dynamics of this particular process. That is, in all these cases, Smith traces the corruption of character directly back to the division of labor. And that is the very process that Smith celebrates in the first book of The Wealth of Nations as the point of departure for commercial growth, turns out to be by the fifth book of The Wealth of Nations the most significant cause of national weakness. And so while I hesitate to use phrases like dialectic, Smith does seem to think that within the seeds of opulence are also the seeds of decline in terms of this internal necessity. So all of this is to say that Smith recognizes that opulence introduces a moral change that quite practically vitiates national power. At the same time, Smith also emphasizes that there are certain institutional and structural processes at work that similarly work to vitiate national power that go beyond the moral question. And so these institutional changes also serve to compromise national defense. And so here, in another passage, Smith again begins by telling us that, quote, it must necessarily happen that as a state of this sort advances in arts and improvements in society, its power and strength must be greatly diminished. But here what his focus is in this necessary change is, again, changes that are the direct consequence of the progress of the division of labor. But the focus here is not simply the corruption of the martial virtues in some moralized sense, but rather in the fact that through the progress of arts and sciences, divided specialized labor encourages workers to see returns on their labor and to stay at the bench, to stay at the field, rather than go out and serve the country and engage in military exercises. In a very direct way, then, practical increases in labor productivity, Smith thinks, lead to a decrease in the available fighting force. And so here, Smith, once again, in a different modality, is developing the same idea that the division of labor is simultaneously the engine of growth, but inimical to national strength, and does so with, again, reference to this necessity, must necessarily, ways that he frames as sort of a natural law. So altogether, I think Smith sees both moral and institutional reasons to believe that opulence will compromise national defense. But complicating all of this further is another necessary fact of national opulence. And the problem here is not only that opulent nations are less able to defend against foreign attack, the problem is that they're also necessarily more likely to become the objects of foreign attack. And as Smith is very fond of saying in both The Wealth of Nations and the Lectures on Jurisprudence, national opulence necessarily, quote unquote, provokes invasion. And this is actually a slide that brings together a number of the themes worth looking at in some detail. I quote, military exercises come to be as much neglected by the inhabitants of the country as by those of the town, and the great body of the people becomes altogether unwarlike. That wealth, at the same time, which always follows the improvements of agriculture and manufactures, and which in reality is no more than the accumulated produce of those improvements, provokes the invasion of all their neighbors. An industrious, and upon that account a wealthy nation, is of all nations the most likely to be attacked. And unless the state takes some new measures for the public defense, the natural habits of the people render them altogether incapable of defending themselves. Now, at the end of this quotation, Smith shades into the question that's most occupied Smith interpreters regarding these passages, and that is the optimal means of providing for national defense. And Smith was actively engaged in a debate over whether a publicly funded standing army or a volunteer militia provided a more effective and more safe for liberty means of defending the nation. As interesting and as important as this issue is, I think it's important not to move too far to his solution without appreciating the entire nature of the problem, which is the tragedy that Smith believes to be at the heart of this economic progress. And that is the simple fact that the wealthy nation is simultaneously less able to defend itself against enemies and much more attractive to those poor enemies that are on their borders. And the upshot of this, Smith clearly envisions, is the problem of the nation's existential annihilation and its quote-unquote death. And here, in a phrase that brings together a number of these themes, Smith tells us how the nation ultimately, quote, falls sacrificed to some of its neighbors. Now, with that very happy image of existential annihilation in mind, I want to make a shift here to the second kind of threats that worry Smith, as if these aren't worrisome enough. Because Smith is both worried about the external threats to the nation, but also, as I mentioned at the outset, the internal threats that come from opulence. And one thing I hope to bring home is the degree to which Smith's vision of these threats is genuinely multifactorial, the degree to which he sees these emerging, even though they come from the common cause of economic growth, manifest themselves in a variety of different modalities. And so one of these concerns then the shift that I want to make now to the ways in which there are compromises of internal stability. Now, to see these compromises, I want to begin by going back, as I did with the first part of the talk, to Smith's vision of the ends and origin of government. And so, as we saw earlier, Smith identifies defense against external threats as the primary aim of government. He follows this in the next section of The Wealth of Nations in 5.1 by explicitly insisting that the second end of government is defense against internal threats, and thus his vision of what he calls, quote unquote, the second duty of the sovereign. The second duty of the sovereign, that of protecting as far as possible every member of the society from the injustice or oppression of every other member of it, or the duty of establishing an exact administration of justice. And so here, there's a certain symmetry in the way Smith frames this, as he does so often in his writings, where the primary aim of government is defense against external violence, the secondary aim is defense against internal violence. But this raises a question. What exactly is the threat against which government needs to defend, the internal threat? Smith is actually very clear on this front in ways that, again, are only now very recently being generally appreciated by even specialists. And so Smith develops his understanding of the particular internal enemies in his a parallel account of the origin of government. And here, in Smith's very interesting account of the origins of government, he tells us that it comes from the emerging inequality between rich and poor. And this is such a rhetorically charged paragraph, I hope you won't mind if I read this. Quote, "When in the manner above mentioned some have great wealth and others nothing, it is necessary that the arm of authority should be continually stretched forth, and permanent laws or regulations, which may ascertain the property of the rich from the inroads of the poor, who would otherwise continually make encroachments upon it, and settle in what the infringement of this property consists, and in what cases they will be liable to punishment. Laws and government may be considered in this, and indeed in every case, as a combination of the rich to oppress the poor, and preserve to themselves the inequality of the goods, which would otherwise be soon destroyed by the attacks of the poor, who, if not hindered by the government, would soon reduce the others to an equality with themselves by open violence," end quote. Now, a very anodyne summary of Smith's claim here would be a version of the Lockean claim that government exists for the protection of property rights. And that's the way that Smith is often presented, and on some level it's undeniably true. The advantage of looking at these particular texts, and not just this one from the Lectures on Jurisprudence, but the parallel passages from Wealth of Nations 5.1b12, shows that Smith's deep worry here is the quote-unquote open violence that is the continual threat, the continually existent threat, in any nation in which there is a division between rich and poor and some degree of inequality. Government is born, Smith says, in the recognition of the need to mitigate this particular threat, and Smith seems to think that the continual existence of this threat is something genuinely real and palpable. He goes further then to tell us that not only is government born in this particular worry about preserving against open violence, but that the state of peace within civil society is in fact a quite precarious peace among those who might otherwise be seen as enemies. And this, at any rate, is how Smith presents civil society in The Wealth of Nations. I won't read the entirety of this particular paragraph here, but we'll focus on specifically the ways in which Smith talks about the condition of modern civil society to be one in which we are always surrounded by, quote unquote, surrounded by unknown enemies, ones who are never provoked, ones we can never appease, and ones whose violence, the only thing standing between us and that, is, of course, the civil magistrate and the coercive power of punishment. Now, I mentioned this because I think it's an important side of Smith that we're starting to lose a little bit. Bruce introduced me as having edited the Theory of Moral Sentiments, and I am a genuine believer in the importance of Smith's moral philosophy and the ways in which he understands sympathy and sentimentalism as connecting bonds within a civil society. All of that is true, but yet, Smith was also a consummate realist when it comes to questions of the threats that are posed to society and to social order by certain types of interests. Smith's belief is then that we need a serious system of coercive force through law and punishment to mitigate and to minimize these particular threats. But at the same time, even as he believes that law is necessary to mitigate these threats, he's aware of the degree to which the growth of opulence has the potential to subvert this order and to augment these threats. Now, to be sure, in many cases, these subversions of social order and social rank, Smith sees as very welcome and salutary. he gives us several accounts of the ways in which the growth of opulence creates a sort of creative destruction that skews existing social dynamics in positive ways. The most important of these by far is his account in the third part of The Wealth of Nations and his account of how feudalism ended as a result of the rise of manufacturing and foreign trade. I won't try to restate that argument, but Smith traces the entire birth of quote-unquote freedom in the modern sense of the word to the ways in which the introduction of manufactures and commerce broke the direct dependence of feudal serfs on feudal landlords. That is the birth of modernity, it's the birth of modern political order, and it came not from anything like a social contract, it came specifically from economic progress. That's the important story of the third book of The Wealth of Nations. But, and this is the fascinating thing about working on Smith, there's always this but. Smith also recognized that times in which there were subversions of existing social orders had the potential to be subversive of social order more generally. And he attests to this in a variety of places. This first quote from the Theory of Moral Sentiments on this slide, Smith attests to the degree to which the quote-unquote stability of a given constitution, that is, a political order, depends upon a balance of powers of different social ranks. This raises his belief, his very sincere and deep-seated belief in this, raises certain challenges when it comes to the question of economic growth and economic mobility. By and large, Smith is a friend of economic opportunity, to be sure, and welcomes economic mobility, and is a great foe of multi-generational wealth. Anyone who's read his comments on primogeniture and entail and his deep hostility to accumulated multi-generational wealth knows that he is not a friend of reified, rigidly hierarchical social classes. But yet, one of the things that his history comes back to again and again and again is the ways in which commercial growth led, especially the former aristocratic classes, to withdraw from society and to withdraw from civil service and especially from military service. And so here in the second quote on this particular slide, Smith is tracing out the ways in which he tells us that the rich and better sort of people withdraw from military service as a result of their enjoyments of commercial opulence and their recognition that they are able to make a buck outside of the army, with the result that the military becomes a much more democratized force, which Smith thinks should be reason for us to give pause about the ways in which this might change the balance of power within a society. That said, if this might be seen as something of another structural worry, the ways in which the withdrawal of one social class skews the balance towards another social class, Smith also introduces a set of moral concerns with regard to internal instability. And here again, Smith traces these back to the division of labor and to specialization in particular. And in the early part of the talk, I emphasized how Smith sees the division of labor as necessarily leading to the corruption of martial virtue. But this is only one side of the moral corruption that worries Smith. Because in addition to these, there's the corruption of what he calls intellectual virtue. Now, in this long paragraph, Smith traces out the effects of daily repetitive labor. And what I want to emphasize here are two things. One is the degree to which this culminates not just in a loss of martial virtue, but in a loss of what he calls the intellectual, social, and martial virtues. And in particular, he tells us that here, this particular stultifying labor makes the human being, quote, as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. Now these, again, are very charged lines. Smith interpreters have tended to go to the bottom of this paragraph to focus on what might be implied by this last line, That is, this is the state in which the, quote, great body of the people must necessarily fall unless government takes some pains to prevent it. And it is incredibly important to ask what he meant by the remedy that he points to here. Why should it be done by government? Why should it be taxpayer funded? And will the system of education that he's proposing here serve to be successful on this front? All of these are very important questions, and I myself have tried to intervene in these debates. But also important here, I think, is the discrete problem to which he's pointing, which is one that is akin to, but disaggregable from, the problem of the corruption of martial virtues. Because the issue here is not the corruption of martial virtues that make people less able to defend against external enemies. The problem here is the corruption of the intellectual virtues that make individuals, as he says, quote unquote, stupid and ignorant, and what right around the corner, he tells us, will make people, quote unquote, mentally mutilated. This is a deep problem, and a problem not just for moral reasons, a problem that is specifically political. And the specific issue is that just as the corruption of martial virtues makes us susceptible to external enemies, the corruption of the intellectual virtues makes us susceptible to certain types of domestic threats, and especially threats by those sorts of politicians and political figures and religious figures and other figures that might seek to prey upon the quote-unquote stupid and ignorant. And so Smith develops this in a couple of discrete paragraphs in which he now paints for us exactly what the torpor of the worker's mind looks like. The most important here, at the end of that first quoted block, quote, of the great and extensive interests of his country, he is altogether incapable of judging. And herein lies the reason why this, quote, gross ignorance and stupidity is a problem in an advanced civilized commercial society. Smith points very directly to the ways in which an uninstructed and stupefied people is susceptible to, quote, the delusions of enthusiasm and superstition, and in particular is unable to see through the interested claims of, quote unquote, faction and sedition that might lead them to, quote, wanton or unnecessary opposition to the measures of government. Smith here, I think, is testifying to the fact that he's deeply aware of the ways in which, especially in a commercializing democratic political order, the stupefaction of individuals through a certain type of labor has profound political consequences and renders a polity open to all types of destabilization. Now, what I've wanted to do in the talk has been to show the degree to which Smith believes that opulence necessarily leads or renders us susceptible to internal and external threats. All of this might prompt one to ask very naturally, to what degree these remain threats for us today? I'm going to leave to you to determine for yourselves whether faction and sedition remain threats for the contemporary political order. And for my part, I want to conclude by noting how Smith himself believed that these threats remained very active in his own day. And to that end, I want very briefly to end by calling attention to three key pieces of empirical evidence where Smith appeals to and marshals evidence in support of his theory. And he presents us, in fact, with three key case studies of nations that fell at the hands of their own opulence. The first of these turns out to be none other than Gibbon's own, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Smith here traces out, in this paragraph and in many others, the ways in which imperial Rome had not just, quote, arrived at a considerable degree of improvement both in arts and commerce, but the ways in which this improvement served to vitiate their power. In the case of Rome, it led them to become less willing to fight against, to engage in the military, and as a result, to hire out military force to the foreign mercenaries in the forms of the northern barbarians. The result of this, as Smith shows in great detail, is the overrunning of the empire by these German and Scythian northerners at the moment that they decided that it was in their interest to turn upon their former masters. Rome thus provides one singular instance, and Smith calls it one of the great revolutions of the world, that proves his theory. Smith tells the same story in another remarkably important case study. And this one moves from antiquity to early modernity. And it involves the fall of, again, a nation that he calls very explicitly one of the most opulent ever to have been. And that nation is 17th century Ming Dynasty China. Smith is deeply interested in the fall of the Ming Dynasty at the hands of the Tartars in the 17th century. And in fact, he takes the sack of opulent and polite China by the barbarian, quote unquote, these are Smith's technical terms, by the Tartars as evidence of his theory. Again, without giving you all the evidence with this particular quote and other quotes, he takes China, 17th century China, as an example of how a quote unquote commercial country, even amidst its wealth and even amidst its military expenditures, is easily penetrated and falls rapidly at the hands of a barbarian neighbor. So Smith gives us then one ancient case study, one early modern case study, and he also wanted to give his modern readers a third contemporary case study. And that contemporary case study was his own society of modern Great Britain. Now Smith, of course, writing in 1776, had a front row seat to the beginning of the ultimate breakup of the colonial British Empire. Smith, writing in London in the early 1770s, was intimately involved with most of the major players responsible for the tax policies and political policies vis-a-vis the American colonies. And Smith took a very definitive stand that actually interestingly evolved over time with regard to the American colonies. All of that I'm deeply interested in and happy to talk about in Q&A, but it really must be the subject of another fuller talk to do it right. Instead, I want to end here with Smith's understanding not just of the precariousness of the British Empire vis-a-vis the colonial outposts, but in fact, much closer to home within the island itself. One of the most remarkable features that I think shaped Smith's early psychology was an event that happened in 1745. In 1745, as many of you likely know, there was an attempted coup in which the Great Pretender under Bonnie Prince Charlie marshaled the Northern Highlanders in an attempt to steal back the crown, the British crown, from the Protestants and bring it back to the Catholics. In marshaling these northern armies, the Bonnie Prince Charlie successfully marched as far as northern England, but marched in particular on Edinburgh. And in 1745, the city guard of Edinburgh, on seeing these quote-unquote 4,000 or 5,000 naked unarmed Highlanders, immediately laid down their guns and chose not to fight. In terror of what they were seeing coming, these barbarian hordes, the civilized, polite city guard of Edinburgh, the Athens of the North, the seat of British Enlightenment, rolled over. And Smith is insistent on saying this wouldn't have happened before. At the end of this, quote, 200 years ago, this would never have happened. Quote, our ancestors were brave and warlike. Their minds were not enervated by cultivating arts and commerce, and they were all ready with spirit and vigor to resist the most formidable foe. The 45, as it came to be known, was for Smith the ultimate refutation of naive or complacent thinking that, quote unquote, it can't happen here. Smith was deeply aware that it did happen here, and he thought there were reasons to believe that it would continue to happen, not just in the Isle of Britain, but in Europe more generally, given what was happening with the Ottomans on the edges of the European community. Smith thought, among other things, that vigilance was important to stave off the decline and fall of the nation of Britain and of Europe more generally. But I think in posing these questions, he invites us to ask whether these particular case studies of Rome, China, and Britain, the degree of their relevance potentially to us in 21st century America today. So with that, I think I'll pause, and hopefully we can open it up for some questions and answers here. Thank you very much. May I go ahead and call? Yeah, great. Okay, yes. Please. Oh, I saw two hands here.
Let me start, Ryan. My question is sort of easy. The four countries, I point out to my students repeatedly that the four countries that the four countries that still exist in the world that in more or less the same form as they did in 1800 are the United States, Great Britain, Switzerland, and Iceland.
Uh-huh.
All of them seem to be countries that pursue prosperity in precisely the way Smith intended, and yet they haven't become. Now, that might just be a geographical oddity because they all are essentially islands of one kind or another. And I wonder whether that's something Smith takes account of, or whether he would see this as a kind of refutation of the position he takes, especially because he does talk about the advantages of the division of labor for the development of military force specialization.
Good. All right. Good. Let's put Iceland to the side, because I think Smith would say, as a matter, as you've alluded, of geographical accident, that it's a different kind of place. Switzerland, I wonder if he wouldn't take that as confirmation rather than refutation of his position. When I was in the midst of doing some work on Rousseau, I had the opportunity to spend some time visiting different places around Lake Geneva, and in studying Swiss history, found it remarkable to see the degree to which their founding stories are founded upon military arms, brothers in arms, and Republican civic virtue. And so I take it that that would be part of Smith's story. As far as America goes, Smith's own account of America is, in 1776, very interesting. As far as what he would have seen predicted in the future and what's come to pass, I won't speculate too much. But what Smith finds remarkable in America, and he celebrates what we now call the American founders, for the degree to which these former shopkeepers and merchants became not just civic-minded, but were willing to take up arms for their own cause. So he there sees, at least in 75 and 76, a balance of both this spirit of willingness for self-defense, but also a dedication to growth and opulence in the pursuit of self-interest. And so I think that Smith's admiration of the America of his day, and he sincerely admired the colonies and the colonists, lies in this very interesting balance of a commitment to economic self-interest and also something that looks like martial virtue. And I've resisted in the formal remarks from using two terms that were once very popular among political theorists, but we tend to use less today, liberalism and republicanism in conversation with another. But I think this is one place in which Smith really does believe, that is the America of 76, that there was a synthesis, not two ideologies at loggerheads, but the best of both combined. So I've resisted talking about republicanism and liberalism because I think those two things, they have long and complex and now contemporary difficult theoretical debates associated with them. But I think that Smith, what he praises in Healthy Nations is its ability to synthesize these two things that academic political theory has tried to disaggregate for so long. Please.
I really appreciate you drawing attention to all of these aspects of courage and military might that do seem very important to Smith and that seem to go away with the development of commerce. But I wonder to what extent you're not finishing the picture or giving us the impression that Smith therefore might have wanted to preserve that courage even at the cost of commerce, where it seems like, I seem to recall he talks about being a coward as almost like leprosy that disfigures you, and it's bad. Like it's a horrible thing for people to become cowardly. But as a solution to the problem of conquest, he does suggest standing armies, and seems to think that, I mean, at the end of the day, Britain succeeded in fending off this attack, and seems to think that investing in a modern standing army is the answer to this. So it's going to be sad that we're all going to be cowardly and effeminate. But we're okay. We're still not going to lose the way the Romans did, because standing armies are the modern solution to the problem. So think civilian-controlled military. So are you pushing against that view, or is this not?
Yes. Okay, for the sake of discussion, I'll push against it in two different ways. One is that I think you're undeniably right, as Smith very clearly does, say that standing armies are the way of the future. And he also sees that there will be an advantage for wealthy, well-funded armies because of the progress of military technology. And so gunpowder, of course, changed everything, and that is rapidly changing the distinction between this war between the quote-unquote barbarian and the civilized. Smith sees that the civilized now have technological advances. So at the same time, I think he would warn us against some complacence that, especially now in our contemporary age, I mean, anybody that's following developments in the South China Sea and the discussions about America's antiquated military fleets knows that simply having military resources at one's command aren't enough. One needs to have updated, one needs to also have merchant marine that's able to actually serve. And we have a great paucity of sailors, not to say anything of the boats. So these still remain to some degree problems, even as you're very right to say Smith was worried, or Smith thought that military technology and standing armies would help obviate them. The second question that you raise is, I think, a really, really, really interesting one. And I would put it in its bluntest form as military courage, really, so what? Do we really need that today? And I think Smith has an argument where he would say yes. But I don't think the argument comes actually from anything that I even said here. I think it comes from his understanding of what justice is as developed in the second part of the theory of moral sentiments. Justice demands what he calls a sympathetic resentment when we see others harmed, that we ourselves will be willing to take action. And I'm glad that you're smiling at this, because I'm really, this is the other paper that I was thinking about presenting but didn't present, but I'm deeply invested in. And it's liberalism and the martial virtues. I think specifically for Smith, aside from the question of the utility of martial courage in terms of national defense, which I do think is important, he also thinks that in simple interpersonal actions that come for standing up for oppressed others, what he calls sometimes martial virtue and martial courage is absolutely important, and individuals unable to do that will be unable to sustain certain processes that in basic care and concern for the rights and well-being of others. Okay. Thank you for the question. Yep, please.
So, I was struck by the kind of necessitarian language that you quoted at the beginning. So must, in all cases, necessarily, on the one hand, and then sometimes these at least suggestions of possible remedies or ways of So, is it the case that this is a natural or iron law that can only be delayed or forestalled, or is there a kind of tension around tyranny in the way he's thinking about this?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And so to give the most direct answer possible, I think he does, when he says that natural, necessary, must, I think he does believe that all wealthy nations in time will fall. In that respect, he very much takes on a very familiar trope from early modern Republican arguments. And I think he's very sincere in believing that. And I think that his lessons, I think I used the term very briefly about staving off. It really isn't a question of if, it's a question of when, and the sorts of ways in which nations are able to defend against that. Also so I think that's sobering, but there's also another side to it, which is this is part and parcel of something much bigger in Smith, which is Smith not only talks about these issues of national defense in terms of long time horizons and what will ultimately naturally come, but he also talks about all kinds of forms of international relations. And he, in a couple of very interesting paragraphs, right after he critiques the East India Company, he has a line where he imagines a far distant future of an equality of nations in which there is a rough equality of opulence among nations that generates a certain balance of power among nations. And so it's easy to critique that as Shangri-La, it's easy to critique that as utopian thinking, it's easy to say that that's a far distant horizon. But I think it's important for this because from the nation's perspective, there is tragedy. There is decline and fall. And it's a question of what can we do now to minimize that suffering and to push that out. But even that decline and fall is part of the national decline and fall is part of a much larger, and I think for Smith, more optimistic international story. How individual citizens of real nations are able to reconcile that tragedy of their nation with the potential optimism that he's inviting us to see for the international community, those are real problems, but I think they're both part of Smith's story. And so, as he does in so many places, points us to the darker sides, but also the lighter sides, even in the death of nations, or the reconfiguration of nations so that they will emerge out of states of gross inequality towards states of equality. Even in those deaths, as bad as they are for the individual citizens, there's something to be welcomed in the far distant future there. I think it's one of those capacious ideas in Smith that I think attests to the degree to which he's able to see in very, I was going to say visionary, but I'll just say far-seeing ways. Yes?
It's not very clear to me why Smith didn't think that specialization could occur also in the army.
Mm-hmm.
Because if in the army we have the ones who are expert in bombs or whatever,
Yeah.
their skills will become scarce, and therefore they will have like higher wages, and they will have an incentive in specializing in being in the army.
Yes, so he does think that, so specialization works on the military art, and he's very explicit. He goes down a number of different, he says in science, in philosophy, in the military, specialization is the way of the future, and it is good for each of these institutions. We get a better army from it. So in the standing army, it will be highly specialized. The difference, and I don't know if this is where you're headed or not, he comes back again and again to the idea that the difference is when you talked about wages and incentivization for people to specialize in certain military careers, the problem is the difference between wartime and peacetime. In wartime, a certain type of military expertise is very desirable. In peacetime, it's not. So one of the arguments Smith makes is that, especially in peacetime, the state needs to prepare for the war to come. And he uses a phrase that I find really very striking. He twice in this paragraph refers to the quote-unquote wisdom of the state. And the wisdom of the state is funding a highly specialized, well-trained army in peacetime, knowing that these threats will emerge in the future. So I think that he sees, yes, absolutely, the utilitarian benefits of military specialization, but also suggests that the wage incentivization of it in peacetime is such that actually here's a place where we need state intervention because there's a lag there. Does that get to the question that you're asking? Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. Yeah, please.
Yeah, so thanks, Dr. Hanley, for presenting all all these stories. I think it was, I think Aristotle said that every courageous act, every virtuous act is in pursuit of something beautiful. Mm-hmm. And does Smith reference that at all, or does he engage with any of like Aristotle's like aesthetics in the sense of if you're going to have this laconic Spartan society, that might come at like the opportunity cost of pursuing like beautiful things, mm-hmm. and if vice versa, like if you're going to be sacrificing these two ideals that are needed for a stable state, how do you strike the proper balance? Does he address that?
Okay. Warning. Many years ago, I wrote a doctoral dissertation on Smith and Aristotle, so these are questions near and dear to my heart, so I'll try not to go too deep down the rabbit hole. But two quick comments. One is that as much as Smith admired military virtue, he did not greatly admire ancient Athens and ancient Sparta. For this particular reason, Smith was deeply aware of the fact that the beauty and nobility of the gentlemen that were able to live virtuous lives were built on the back of the enforced enslavement of many more people. And so Smith, as a true friend of modern liberty, and a deep opponent of slavery, is interested in the question of whether there can be virtue for all without the social conditions of slavery. So there's a difference. Where there's agreement, and this is now the dissertation topic, is that Smith deeply revered, you use the term aesthetic, I might sort of hedge that a little bit, but deeply revered the beauty of the noble. And he talks again and again in the Theory of Moral Sentiments about the honorable and the noble as the ultimate object of the wise and virtuous man's pursuit. And so he introduces us to a number of figures, including, for those interested in Aristotle, he talks a lot, Smith does, more than any other modern philosopher I know, about magnanimity. And Smith is deeply interested in preserving, even amidst commercial modernity, a reverence for the type of figures who would engage in something like what Aristotle's great-souled man engages in. So one of the reasons I like Smith so much and why I find him such an important figure for the world in which we live is that I think Smith is very consciously attempting to preserve Aristotelian understandings of virtue, but within the context not of the 5th century ancient polis, but within the very complex modern commercial world in which we find ourselves. So I see Smith as a very important conduit for ancient ideals in a deeply complex modern world that he understood well.
I think we've come to the end of our time, so I'd like to thank Dr. Hanley. But before we do, I do have a quick announcement for any of the students who are here. There's going to be a summer school in Scotland in the end of June and early July that's going to be on the work of Adam Smith. And Duke students can actually go there. You have to pay your way, probably come to about $4,000. But it's going to be run by Craig Smith, who is another
good man,
superb Smith scholar. And it will involve not only learning about Smith's work, but also visiting all of the seminal sites that were crucial to his development, from Kirkcaldy, where he was born, to Edinburgh, where he lived, and Glasgow, where he taught. So it looks like it's a fantastic program. If anyone is interested in that, as you go out, you can see my name, bruce.caldwell@duke.edu, and just send me an email. I'll send you the information that you'll need to be able to make a sound decision.
Can I say, apropos of that, in that edition of the Theory of Moral Sentiments, I said something, I give out my own email address, which has now since been updated, but I will never write undergraduate papers for you, but if you have questions about Adam Smith, I'm always happy to try and be a resource in that respect. So my email is ryan.hanley@bc.edu. I think it's up there somewhere, so please feel free to be in touch.